Ever feel like a cog in a machine, just going through the motions day after day? It's a question many men face, especially around middle age. The weight of responsibility, the relentless routine, the feeling of being stuck. This is the story of Vince, a 45-year-old CNC machine operator, and how he found strength in the most unexpected place, a 2-minute drive. For 22 years, Vince had stood in the same 10-foot square, the hum of the CNC machine his constant companion. His life had become a predictable rhythm. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. He provided for his family, his wife, Sarah, and his son, Leo, in their small house in a working-class neighborhood. He was proud of that. But beneath the surface, a disquiet was growing. He felt like a component, repeating the same actions until he wore out, and that thought kept him awake at 3 a.m. The weight of his life pressed down on him. $35,000 left on his Ford F-150 loan and $7,000 on a high-interest credit card from replacing the roof. He longed to feel alive again, like the man who rebuilt his 1978 Triumph Bonneville, the man who dreamed of owning an auto shop with his buddy. Now his world felt like a factory floor, a monotonous cycle he couldn't escape. One evening, Vince overheard Sarah talking to her sister. "It's like he's just stuck," she said, her voice tight with sadness. "And I'm stuck right here with him." That night, Vince couldn't sleep. Sarah's words echoed in his head. He knew he was letting her down, letting Leo down, letting himself down. The next morning, unable to face the house, he walked out into the pre-dawn cold. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to move. His hand instinctively went to his pocket for his cigarettes, but stopped. He didn't reach for one, just walked. The simple, rhythmic act of walking quieted the noise in his head for the first time in years. As the sky began to lighten, casting a pale blue hue on the empty street, Vince realized something profound. He didn't need a grand solution, a winning lottery ticket, or a different life. He just needed to move. Vince's daily routine was a well-worn groove. 4:30 a.m. alarm, a silent cup of black coffee, and out the door by 5:15 a.m. for the 2-minute drive to the factory. 2 minutes. It felt like the distance between his life and something more. Each morning, the same gray sky, the same empty streets, the same knot of dread tightening in his gut. He was a CNC machine operator, 22 years of experience, and every day felt like a repeat of the last. His hands, thick with calluses and crisscrossed with scars, gripped the steering wheel of his Ford F-150, each drive a reminder of the $35,000 still owed. The truck was supposed to be a reward, a symbol of his hard work. Instead, it felt like another chain. He glanced at the passenger seat where a crumpled receipt for a new router bit lay. Another expense, another worry to add to the $7,000 already weighing him down on that high-interest credit card from the roof replacement. At 45, Vince felt older than his years. His square face was etched with deep crow's feet from squinting against the machine glare, and a perpetual 3-day stubble hid the weariness in his pale blue eyes. He remembered his father, a mechanic who taught him the value of a steady job. But a steady job had become a life sentence. He dropped out of community college at 19 to help his parents after his father's heart attack. He'd always meant to go back, to become an engineer, maybe even open that auto shop with his buddy, but life had a way of rerouting those dreams. Now, he stood for 10 hours a day in a 10-foot square, shaping metal, his wiry frame hunched over the machine. He was good at it, damn good. He could diagnose problems by the sound of the motor, anticipate errors before they happened. But the pride he once felt had been replaced by a dull ache of resignation. He was trapped. That night, the silence at the dinner table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Leo, his 15-year-old son, was lost in his video games, his eyes glued to the screen. Sarah, his wife of 16 years, barely spoke, her face pale and drawn. He remembered when they first met, her bright smile, her infectious laugh. Now they were ships passing in the night, sharing a house, sharing bills, but not much else. He longed to connect with Leo, to share his love of motorcycles, but every attempt seemed to fall flat. They were strangers, living under the same roof. Later, he found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man staring back was a stranger. Where was the fire, the passion? Where was the man who rebuilt a Triumph Bonneville from the ground up, the man who taught his son to ride a bike, the man who felt alive? He saw only exhaustion, a quiet desperation that threatened to consume him. He thought about Sarah, about Leo, about the life he was failing to provide not financially, but emotionally. The next morning, as he walked in the pre-dawn chill, he remembered the feel of his father's calloused hands, the smell of oil and gasoline in his garage, the satisfaction of fixing something broken. He reached into his pocket, his fingers grazing the familiar pack of cigarettes, then paused. He didn't need the fleeting comfort. He needed something more. As the sky began to lighten, he kept walking. The 2-minute drive suddenly seemed like an eternity, a distance he needed to close one step at a time. The alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., a jarring intrusion into the thin sliver of sleep Vince managed to find. He slapped the snooze button, the habit ingrained after years of resisting the inevitable. The thought of another day at the machine, the relentless screech and grind of metal on metal, was a lead weight in his stomach. 22 years? 22 years staring at blueprints, adjusting feeds, pulling levers. He was a CNC machine operator, and that was all he was. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant reminder of the toll his job took. Sarah stirred beside him, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He watched her for a moment, the lines around her eyes deeper than he remembered. He knew he wasn't the man she deserved, the man she fell in love with. He was a shell going through the motions. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep. She didn't respond, already drifting back into her own world. Downstairs, the coffee maker gurgled, filling the small kitchen with its bitter aroma. He poured himself a cup, black the way he liked it. He glanced at the calendar on the refrigerator, marked with bills due, appointments, the relentless march of days. $42,000 in debt. The truck, the credit card, another reminder of the financial pressures that kept him chained to the machine. Outside, the sky was still a dark, pre-dawn blue. He climbed into his F-150, the rumble of the engine a familiar comfort. The 2-minute drive to the factory felt like an eternity. Each day blurred into the next, a monotonous cycle of work, exhaustion, and quiet despair. He thought about the dream he and his buddy had, opening their own auto shop. They were young, full of energy, ready to take on the world. Now his buddy was a regional manager at a chain garage, and Vince was this. He pulled into the parking lot, the rows of cars stretching out like tombstones. He saw the same faces, the same tired expressions, the same resigned shuffle towards the entrance. They were all just trying to make it, to provide for their families, to get by. But at what cost? He punched his time card at 6:00 a.m. sharp, a silent ritual marking the start of another day in the metallic cage. He walked to his machine, the familiar scent of oil and coolant filling his nostrils. He put on his safety glasses, steeling himself for the noise, the repetition, the endless grind. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the day ahead, the weight of his life pressing down on him. The machine roared to life, shaking the floor beneath his feet. Vince adjusted the settings, his hands moving with practiced ease. 22 years. 22 years he'd stood in this same spot, operating this same type of machine. The thought felt like a physical blow. He could feel the familiar tension building in his shoulders, the dull ache in his lower back. He focused on the task at hand, the rhythmic whir of the machine a constant drone in his ears. But today, the noise felt different, louder, more oppressive. Later that evening, Vince sat on the couch, the TV flickering in the dim light. Sarah was in the kitchen, clattering dishes. Leo was upstairs, lost in his video games. The house felt empty. He watched a documentary about World War II, something about the courage of the soldiers. But he couldn't connect. It all felt so distant, so meaningless. He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to fill the room. Then he heard it, Sarah's voice, muffled but clear, coming from the kitchen. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words drifted through the thin walls, sharp and cutting. She was on the phone, talking to her sister. He heard his name, then a pause. "It's like he's just stuck," she said, her voice cracking. "And I'm stuck right here with him." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. That's what he was. Stuck in this house, stuck in this job, stuck in this life. He could hear the pain in Sarah's voice, the frustration, the resignation. And he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he was the cause. He was suffocating her, his son, himself. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, so intense that it was almost unbearable. He wanted to disappear, to run away, to escape the weight of his failure. He sat there, frozen, the TV a meaningless blur. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound of Sarah's voice, the weight of her words. He thought about Leo, about the distance that had grown between them. He thought about Sarah, about the woman he had promised to love and cherish, the woman he was now slowly killing with his silence and his resignation. He opened his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't keep living this way. He stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked into the kitchen, Sarah's back to him. He cleared his throat. She turned around, her eyes red and swollen. He couldn't meet her gaze. "I'm going for a walk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't wait for her to respond. He walked out the door into the night, the cold air a welcome shock to his system. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew he had to move. He had to do something, anything. The pre-dawn air bit at Vince's exposed skin, a sharp contrast to the stale, recycled air of the factory. He walked without direction, his work boots heavy on the cracked sidewalk. Each step was a small act of defiance against the inertia that had gripped him for so long. He could almost hear the rhythmic hum of the CNC machine in his head, a constant, monotonous drone that mirrored the emptiness in his soul. 22 years feeding metal to the beast, turning raw material into what? Just more parts for a world that didn't seem to care. He remembered his father, a grease-stained grin permanently etched on his face as he tinkered with engines. That was real work, tangible, honest. Vince had wanted that to build something with his own hands. The memory of that abandoned dream, the auto shop with his buddy, stung like a phantom limb. College, the shop, all gone. Replaced by the steady paycheck, the mortgage, the responsibility. Responsibility. A word that had become a cage. He stopped at the corner of Oak and Maple, the streetlights casting a sickly yellow glow. He saw his reflection in the darkened window of a closed bakery, a tired man etched with worry, a stranger even to himself. The scar above his right eyebrow, a badge of honor from his reckless youth, seemed to mock him now. What was he doing? He was 45 years old, halfway through his life, and he felt like he was already gone. The words echoed in his head, Sarah's broken voice. It's like he's just stuck. He tasted bitterness, a metallic tang rising from his gut. He had to change. Not for the job, not for the bills. For Sarah, for Leo, for himself. He clenched his fists, the calluses on his palms digging into his skin. A resolve hardened within him, slow and sure, like metal cooling in a mold. He whispered the words under his breath, the sound swallowed by the early morning stillness. I'm done living like this. It wasn't a shout, not a declaration, just a quiet statement of fact. But in that moment, standing on that deserted corner, Vince felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, a single spark in the darkness, threatening to ignite. He turned and started walking again, the rhythm of his footsteps a promise to himself. It was just a walk, 2 minutes from home, but it was a start. The next morning, Vince woke before the alarm. 4:00 a.m. The house was silent, Sarah and Leo still asleep. He felt a pull, an unfamiliar urge to get out, to move. He brewed a pot of coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen, a familiar comfort. He thought of Sarah, her face creased with worry, and Leo, lost in the digital world he couldn't understand. He owed them more than a silent presence on the couch. He grabbed his worn denim jacket, the one he'd had since he was a teenager, and slipped out the back door. The air was crisp, biting at his skin, a welcome shock to his system. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay inside. He walked, not with purpose, not to get anywhere, just to walk. Down his street past the identical ranch houses, each with its neatly manicured lawn, each a mirror of his own life. The houses blurred together. The streetlights cast long shadows. His boots crunched on the frozen grass. He remembered his father, hands black with grease, teaching him to fix a carburetor. A steady hand and a clear head, he'd said. That's all you need. Vince's hands were still steady, but his head. It felt like a machine shop, the noise deafening, the gears grinding. The truck payment loomed, $675 a month, a constant weight. The credit card debt, the leaky faucet, the endless list of things he couldn't fix. He reached the corner of Oak and Maple again, the same corner where he'd made his silent vow. He paused, remembering Sarah's voice, the pain etched in every syllable. It was a defining sound. What had been bubbling for years finally boiled over. He started walking again, faster this time, his breath clouding in the cold air. He imagined Sarah in their first apartment, laughing as he tried to cook spaghetti. The memory was sharp, vivid. He wanted that back. He needed that back. He walked for 20 minutes, then 30. He didn't know how far he went, but he didn't stop until his lungs burned and his legs ached. He sat on a park bench, watching the sun begin to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, but it was different this time. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness of a man defeated. It was the satisfying ache of physical exertion, the quiet pride of having done something, anything, for himself. Back home, Sarah was making breakfast. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He met her gaze, something he hadn't done in a long time. "I went for a walk," he said simply. She studied his face, searching for something. He saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a fragile ember that he desperately wanted to fan into a flame. "Coffee's ready," she said, turning back to the stove. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Vince felt like he had a chance. It started with a walk, the 2-minute drive to turn things around. He hoped this was a beginning. He truly did. The coffee was strong, black, just the way he liked it. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Sarah move around the small space, her movements familiar. 20 years. He'd spent 20 years watching her make breakfast, pack lunches, manage their life. He hadn't seen her. Not really. Not like he saw the tolerances on a blueprint. He thought about Leo, upstairs, probably still asleep, lost in some video game world. Vince felt a pang of guilt. He'd been so wrapped up in his own misery he'd forgotten he was a father. He was 45 and time was moving faster. He finished his coffee, the silence heavy. He needed to say something. "I'm going to start walking every morning," he said, his voice rough. Sarah paused, a spatula in her hand. "Walking?" she asked, her eyebrows raised. "Yeah," he said, "before work, just clearing my head." He didn't explain more, didn't mention the conversation he'd overheard, didn't mention the fear that had been eating him alive. Some things were too raw for words. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the linoleum. He walked to the door, grabbing his jacket off the hook. It was his old work jacket, worn and faded but comfortable. He turned back to Sarah, meeting her gaze. "See you later," he said. He didn't say, "I love you." He hadn't said it in so long. Instead, he just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was a start. Outside, the air was still cold, the sky a pale gray. He started walking, his boots crunching on the frost-covered sidewalk. He didn't have a plan, just a vague sense of direction. He thought about the CNC machine, the relentless hum, the endless repetition. He thought about his father working in the auto shop, hands covered in grease, always fixing something. He'd always wanted to be like his dad, a provider, a steady hand. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost himself. He walked past the park, past the elementary school, past the houses that all looked the same. He thought about his Triumph Bonneville sitting in the garage, half-finished. He'd started restoring it a year ago, but lost interest. He hadn't touched it in months. He thought about the open road, the wind in his face, the feeling of freedom, a secret dream buried deep beneath layers of responsibility and fear. He pictured Sarah beside him, laughing the way she used to. He reached a stop sign, the intersection quiet. He looked left, then right. He made a promise, a silent vow. He would walk every morning, rain or shine, even if he didn't feel like it. Even if it didn't change anything. He would walk. For himself. For Sarah. For Leo. He would walk and maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back. He turned around, heading home. The 2-minute drive was becoming a journey. His journey. The next morning, the alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., a familiar tormentor. Vince groaned, his back already protesting. He thought about hitting snooze, about burying himself under the covers and forgetting the promise he'd made. The CNC machine beckoned, a cold metal siren calling him back to his routine. The thought of Sarah's face, the pain he'd heard in her voice, pulled him up. He laced up his worn work boots, the leather cracked and stiff. Black coffee, scalding hot, burned his tongue as he walked to the door. The garage was his refuge, but the motorcycle mocked him, a silent testament to his stalled dreams. He paused, hand on the doorknob, a battle raging inside. Today, the walk won. He stepped out into the darkness. The first few days were hell. His legs ached, his lungs burned, and his mind screamed at him to stop. The familiar ache in his lower back intensified, a dull throb that echoed the ache in his soul. He thought about his $42,000 debt, the leaky faucet in the kitchen, the looming pile of bills. He thought about Leo, his quiet son, lost in the digital world, a world Vince didn't understand. He kept walking. One morning, a light rain started to fall, turning the sidewalk slick. Vince almost turned back, but then he remembered his father working in the pouring rain to fix a neighbor's car, refusing to come inside until the job was done. A steady job was the highest virtue. His father's voice echoed in his head. He kept walking, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He passed Mrs. Henderson's house. She was out tending her garden, a splash of color against the gray morning. Waved, a bright smile on her face. "Morning, Vince. Out for a stroll?" she asked. He just nodded, a grunt escaping his lips. He walked on, feeling the weight of his $35,000 truck payment, the high-interest credit card, the stagnant air of his life. One evening, Sarah found him staring at the ceiling in bed. "What's wrong, Vince?" she asked, her voice soft. He hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "Just tired," he mumbled, turning away from her. She didn't press him, but he felt her gaze on his back, a silent question he couldn't answer. He yearned to tell her about the walks, about the small flicker of hope he felt, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't ready to be vulnerable, not yet. The walks weren't magical. They didn't solve his problems or erase his debt. But they did something else. They carved out a small space, a pocket of quiet in the chaos of his life. He started noticing things he hadn't seen before. The way the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the birds singing in the trees, the smell of freshly cut grass. The small things, the things he'd been too busy to notice. By the end of the first week, the physical pain had lessened, replaced by a strange sense of calm. Vince still felt the weight of his responsibilities, the pressure of his unfulfilled dreams, but it wasn't as crushing. The 2-minute drive was still a journey, a slow, deliberate march towards something he couldn't quite define. A journey he would walk, for himself, and maybe, just maybe, for them. The second week, the walks became easier. The pre-dawn chill didn't bite as hard, the ache in his back loosened its grip. On day 12, he found himself unconsciously quickening his pace, his boots hitting the pavement with a bit more purpose. The resignation that had clung to him like a shroud began to fray at the edges. It was a subtle shift, barely perceptible, but Vince felt it. A small spark of defiance against the relentless monotony of his life as a 45-year-old CNC machine operator. One morning, as he passed Mrs. Henderson tending her roses, she offered him a freshly cut bloom. "Thought you could use a little color in your day, Vince," she said with a knowing smile. He took the rose, its velvety petals soft against his calloused fingers. He hadn't held a flower in years, not since he and Sarah planted petunias in their tiny garden when Leo was a toddler. That memory, long buried beneath layers of work and worry, surfaced with unexpected clarity. Day 16 brought another small victory. Leo, his 15-year-old son, was tinkering with his bike in the driveway as Vince returned from his walk. "Need a hand?" Vince asked, surprising himself as much as Leo. Leo looked up, startled. Maybe." This chain's being a pain. Vince knelt beside him, his hands instinctively finding the right tools. He showed Leo how to loosen the tension, how to realign the gears. For the first time in what felt like years, they talked, not about school or chores, but about something they both understood. A shared moment of connection, forged in grease and metal. The third week, the walks became a ritual, an unshakable part of his day. On day 21, Vince found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his pale blue eyes. He caught his reflection in a shop window and barely recognized the man staring back. The lines of weariness were still there, etched deep into his face, but there was something else, too. A glimmer of hope, a flicker of life. He started leaving earlier, before the sky even began to light. The darkness was a blanket, a soft barrier between him and the world. He walked further, exploring the streets around his working-class neighborhood. He passed houses that looked just like his own, modest 1980s ranch homes, each a testament to lives lived, dreams chased, and compromises made. One morning, he saw a sign for a local motorcycle repair shop. It was a small, unassuming place tucked away on a side street. The sign was faded, the paint peeling, but something about it drew him in. He paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. The dream he and his buddy had back in their 20s, opening a small auto shop, resurfaced. A pang of regret shot through him, sharp and familiar. He pushed the feeling aside. He wasn't 19 anymore. He had responsibilities, a mortgage, a family. That evening, Sarah noticed the rose he'd placed in a small vase on the kitchen table. "That's pretty," she said, her voice soft. "Mrs. Henderson gave it to me," Vince replied, not meeting her eye. He started washing the dishes, the familiar rhythm of comfort. Sarah leaned against the counter, watching him. "You seem different," she said, her voice hesitant. He stopped washing, turned to face her. He couldn't explain it, not yet. But he knew she saw something, a change, however small. "Just trying to be better," he said, finally making eye contact. The silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken words, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with possibility, the start of a dialogue, a bridge rebuilt. The next few weeks unfolded with a quiet, steady rhythm. Vince continued his early morning walks, the ritual becoming as necessary as his morning coffee. He walked further, pushing himself a little more each day. He found a park a mile or two from his house, a patch of green amidst the gray concrete. He would sit on a bench, watching the sun rise, the world slowly waking up. It was a small thing, a simple act, but it felt like a victory. A reclaiming of something he thought he had lost. At work, his colleagues noticed a change. He was still quiet, still the same stoic Vince they had known for years, but there was a new alertness in his eyes. He offered to help a younger operator who was struggling with a complex program. He hadn't done that in years. He even cracked a joke, a rare event that drew surprised smiles from his coworkers. "Didn't know you had it in you, Vince," one of them said, slapping him on the back. He just shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. At home, the change was even more profound. He started initiating conversations with Sarah, asking about her day, really listening to her answers. He helped Leo with his homework, struggling to understand the new math, but trying nonetheless. One evening, he found Leo tinkering with an old video game console in the garage. "Need a hand?" Vince asked, his voice hesitant. Leo looked up, surprised. "You know about this stuff?" he asked. Vince smiled. "I used to fix everything around here," he said. They spent the next few hours working side by side, father and son connected by the shared language of tools and machines. One night, Vince sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills spread out before him. The $7,000 on the credit card loomed like a dark cloud. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. Sarah walked into the kitchen, drawn by his distress. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated, then pointed to the bills. "I feel like I'm drowning," he said, his voice low. Sarah sat down beside him, taking his hand. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm. "We always do." He looked at her, seeing the strength in her eyes, the unwavering support that had been there all along. "I'm going to get a second job," he said, his voice resolute. "Just until we get this paid off." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you look." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. A shared burden, a united front. The start of something better together. Vince started scouring the classifieds, old habits kicking in. He'd always been a fixer, a problem solver. He'd spent years hunched over engines, coaxing life back into rusted metal. Now he needed to fix his life, his finances. He saw an ad for a small engine repair shop looking for a part-time mechanic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. He called the number, his voice a little rough from disuse. "Yeah, I saw your ad," he said. "I'm a CNC operator, but I've been working on engines since I was a kid. Think I could give you a hand?" The owner, a gruff old-timer named Earl, told him to come by the next day. Earl's shop was a greasy haven, a symphony of clanging wrenches and sputtering engines. It smelled like oil and gasoline, a scent that took Vince back to his father's garage. He felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. Earl watched him work for an hour, tearing down a stubborn lawnmower engine with practiced ease. "You got a knack for this," Earl grunted, wiping his hands on a rag. "You start Monday." The extra money helped, but it was more than that. Working with his hands, solving mechanical puzzles, it filled a void in Vince. He was building something again, not just churning out parts on a machine. The tension in his shoulders eased, the ache in his back lessened. He even started whistling again, a habit Sarah hadn't heard in years. One Saturday, Leo came out to the garage while Vince was tinkering with his Bonneville. "What are you doing?" Leo asked, his voice devoid of its usual teenage monotone. "Just tuning her up," Vince said, wiping grease from his hands. "Want to learn?" Leo hesitated, then nodded. Vince showed him how to adjust the carburetor, explaining the intricacies of the engine with a passion he hadn't displayed in years. Leo listened intently, his eyes bright with curiosity. It was a connection, a bridge built on shared interest. One evening, after a long day at both jobs, Vince found Sarah in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked dinner. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. She leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "You feel different," she said, her voice soft. "Like you're really here." Vince held her tighter, burying his face in her hair. "I am," he whispered. "I'm here." The rhythm of Vince's life had changed. The morning walks became sacred time, a mental reset before the day's demands. At 45, he felt a strength building not in his muscles, but somewhere deeper. He still went to the factory, still operated the CNC machine. But something was different. He wasn't just a component in a machine. Earl, the owner of the small engine repair shop, kept him busy. Lawn mowers, snow blowers, even the occasional vintage motorcycle, Vince tackled them all with a focused calm. He could see the machine's problem clear in his head, just like he could see a solution to the problem that had haunted him. He remembered his dad, always fixing things, always calm. It was a legacy of sorts, a skill passed down. It was honest work, work that made a difference. He was good with his hands, always had been. The factory made him forget that. At work, his increased focus translated into fewer errors, faster turnaround times. His supervisor noticed. "Vince," he said one afternoon, "we're looking for a lead man for the night shift. Think you're interested?" The pay was better, of course, but more importantly, it was a chance to teach, to guide, to share the knowledge he had accumulated over 22 years. "I'll take it," Vince said, his voice firm. His coworkers clapped him on the back. There was respect there, a sense of camaraderie he hadn't felt in years. That night, he told Sarah and Leo about the promotion. Sarah smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "That's great, Vince," she said. "You deserve it." Leo, glued to his video game as usual, paused and looked up. "Cool," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. It wasn't effusive, but it was enough. Small victories, he thought. one step at a time. Maybe this new job would finally help him pay off that stubborn truck loan. One evening, Leo asked Vince for help with a math problem. He almost brushed him off, citing tiredness, but then he remembered Sarah's words. "Like you're really here." He sat down with Leo, patiently explaining the concepts, showing him how to break down the problem into smaller, manageable parts. It took an hour, but Leo finally got it. The look on his son's face, the spark of understanding, was worth more than any overtime pay. Vince's 1978 Triumph Bonneville gleamed in the garage, almost finished. Spent his Sunday afternoons restoring it piece by piece. Leo, surprisingly, started helping. He would hand Vince tools, ask questions, even offer suggestions. It was a shared project, a connection forged in grease and gasoline. "Dad," Leo said one day, "can you teach me how to ride this thing?" Vince smiled. "Absolutely," he said. It was time to pass on another legacy. The scar above Vince's right eyebrow, a memento from his apprentice days, seemed to fade a little. The crow's feet around his eyes were still there, but they were softer now, etched with a hint of a smile. He was still tired, still worked long hours. He was only 45, but felt a renewed purpose. It wasn't about the money, though that helped with the $42,000 in debt looming. It was about being present, about being engaged, about being a husband, a father, a man. Day 87. Vince laced up his worn work boots, the familiar creak, a sound he barely registered anymore. He walked out the door and the crisp morning air bit at his cheeks. The walk had become a ritual, a non-negotiable part of his day. Today felt different, though. A lightness he hadn't felt in years buoyed him, a quiet hum of anticipation. It wasn't just the endorphins from the exercise, it was something more profound. At the factory, the CNC machine roared to life, a familiar symphony of metal on metal. But even the incessant clang and whine seemed muted today. Vince focused on the work, his hands moving with practiced ease, the rhythmic precision honed over 2 decades. He remembered his father, a mechanic, always preaching the value of honest work. He understood it now, not just as a means to an end, but as a way to take pride in your craft, a way to build with your own hands. Lunch came and went, the same stale coffee and lukewarm sandwich. But the monotony didn't bother him as much. He thought about Leo, tinkering with the Bonneville in the garage. He pictured Sarah, her face softening as she talked about his son's growing interest in mechanics. It was enough to keep him going. Later that afternoon, his supervisor, a wiry man named Dave, called him into his office. Vince's stomach clenched. Dave was usually all business, never one for small talk. "Vince," Dave said, shuffling papers, "corporate approved that efficiency bonus we talked about. Your work on the new drilling rig helped us beat our deadline by a week." Vince blinked, surprised. A bonus. He hadn't expected it. It was a significant amount, enough to make a real dent in his debt. He left Dave's office in a daze. He knew exactly what he had to do. He drove straight to the bank after work, the Ford F-150 humming beneath him. He walked inside, the sterile fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor. He went to the loan officer, a young woman with a practiced smile. "I want to make a large payment on my truck loan," he said, his voice firm. He watched as she processed the transaction, the numbers ticking down on the screen. A weight lifted from his shoulders, lighter than he imagined. That evening, Vince sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, the bills spread out before them. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the bank statement. "The bonus. I put a huge chunk towards the truck." Sarah's eyes widened. "Vince, that's amazing. How much is left?" He told her the remaining balance, a significantly smaller number than before. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine smile he hadn't seen in a long time. "We're getting there," she said, her voice filled with hope. Leo walked into the kitchen, headphones around his neck. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing the unusual excitement. Vince beckoned him closer. "Son," he said, "we just took a big step towards paying off that old truck of mine." Leo grinned. "That's awesome, Dad." He clapped Vince on the back, a rare display of affection. Later, Vince walked out to the garage, the Triumph Bonneville gleaming under the dim light. He ran his hand over the smooth curve of the gas tank, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingertips. He thought about his secret dream, the RV, the open road, the freedom. It still seemed distant, but not impossible. He could hear Leo inside, strumming a chord on the old guitar Vince hadn't touched in years. He picked